I'm Elaine Reyes at the United Nations headquarters in New York, and this is UN Insider.
Coming up,
global solidarity and solutions are needed more than ever. The climate crisis is raging, inequalities are growing, and poverty is on the rise.
calls for a reformed Security Council and stronger cooperation as China hosts a special event on multilateralism. A violent conflict intensifies in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Hundreds of thousands are forced to flee as armed groups make deadly advances.
We have to be able to avoid the existential threats from nuclear weapons, from climate change, from poverty, from the devastation that we are facing.
Embracing the UN spirit to tackle the world's problems. A conversation with Pakistan's ambassador. Next.
This year marks the 80th anniversary of the UN. Multilateralism remains at the core of the UN mission, but a lot has changed in the last 8 decades. This week, China held a signature event focused on multilateralism. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi chaired the Security Council event. Jody Jacobs has the details.
This is one of China's signature debates for the month of February in its capacity as the president of the Security Council. Addressing the 15-member council on Tuesday, China's foreign minister made it clear that multilateralism and international law should be upheld at all costs.
Members cannot just sit by and watch multilateral institutions become dysfunctional and ineffective due to their own failure to cooperate. The Security Council must rise above narrow-minded geopolitical considerations, champion the spirit of solidarity and cooperation, fulfill its duties conferred by the UN Charter, and effectively play its role for the maintenance of international peace and security.
Tuesday's meeting here in New York comes at a time of significant geopolitical tensions among some major powers, especially following Donald Trump's return to the White House last month. Already the US president has withdrawn and paused critical aid to key UN agencies. Wang Yi says that the time has come to speed up efforts to build a more just and equitable global governance system.
The Security Council was entrusted with authority, and such authority should be upheld by all countries. Any act of bullying, trickery or extortion is a flagrant violation of the basic norms of international relations. Any unilateral sanction that circumvents Security Council authorization lacks legal basis, defies justification and contradicts common sense.
China's top diplomat told council members that China continues to advocate for a political settlement in Ukraine and fully supports all efforts conducive to peace talks. He also added that Gaza and the West Bank are the homeland of the Palestinian people and should not be used as a bargaining chip in political trade-offs. Meanwhile, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, too, called on the Security Council to begin playing a more active and unified role in maintaining peace and security.
I call on members of this council to overcome the divisions that are blocking effective action for peace. The world looks to you to act in meaningful ways to end conflicts and ease the suffering these wars inflict on innocent people.
While members call for reform and change, much will depend on the Council's permanent members who hold the veto to enact this change. The United States remains critical of the world body and says it is currently conducting a review of its support to the UN and will consider whether the actions of the organization are serving American interests and whether it can be reformed. Jody Jacobs, CGTN, New York.
From the Security Council to the briefing room and beyond, Shu Deja is monitoring the latest developments inside the UN. Deja.
Yes, Elaine. This is a big week at the Security Council, with China's signature event taking center stage. But first, let's talk about Ukraine. We've seen a dramatic shift in the Ukraine crisis, particularly with the US swiftly altering its policy. On Monday, the Security Council, at Russia's request, held a meeting on the Minsk Agreement and Ukraine. Assistant Secretary General Miroslav Yencha urged all stakeholders to step up efforts to end the war and call for greater international cooperation in achieving a just peace.
We reiterate the Secretary General's call on all countries to help prepare the ground for a just peace. And we stand ready to use our good offices and to make available all our tools and experience in support of such efforts.
But what really stood out was the U.S. change in tone. Watch this.
As our Secretary of Defense stated last week at the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, we want a sovereign and prosperous Ukraine. But we must start by recognizing that returning to Ukraine's pre-2014 borders is an unrealistic objective.
Now, what does the UN think about the US-Russia meeting in Saudi Arabia, which discussed the Ukraine crisis without Ukraine's participation?
What the Secretary General would like to see and what he's been pushing for is a just and lasting peace in Ukraine, in line with General Assembly resolutions, in line with international law, and in line with the territorial integrity of Ukraine.
Well, judging by the response, the UN doesn't seem particularly eager to be involved in these negotiations. At this stage, there are no concrete details, and it remains unclear what conditions all parties would accept. But what we know for sure is that the next Monday, on the third anniversary of the Ukraine crisis, both Security Council and the General Assembly will hold meetings on this issue. The General Assembly is expected to adopt another resolution on Ukraine during its 11th emergent session. But now, let's turn to the main event, China's signature event on the implementation of multilateralism. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi presided over the Security Council meeting. And the topic drew immense attention. Over 100 member states requested to speak. And here's what UN Secretary General Mr. Antonio Guterres had to say.
And because we believe in the singular value and purpose of the United Nations, we must always strive to improve the institution and the way we work. We have the hardware for international cooperation, but the software needs an update. An update in representation to reflect the realities of today. An update in support for developing countries to redress historical injustices. An update to ensure countries adhere to the purposes, principles, and norms that ground multilateralism in justice and fairness. And an update to all peace operations.
I also spoke with Pakistan's Deputy Prime Minister Ishaq Dar about why multilateralism still matters. For me, one would say that maybe it's not really a very good time to talk about multilateralism, globally. What do you think of the importance nowadays?
So the governance has the multilateral institutions, particularly the UN and the financial institutions, the governance system of these institutions have been weakening for quite some time. And the two examples I gave you, Palestine and Kashmir, are very, very, obvious to. So I compliment, choosing of, a theme and subject for dialogue at the Security Council level.
Following the meeting, Wang Yi addressed dysfunction of the Security Council to the press.
And in recent years, in the face of some major crises and conflicts, indeed, the Security Council needs to take more effective and timely actions, and the current situation cannot continue anymore. The 80th anniversary of the United Nations is a good opportunity to revisit the founding missions and to keep up with the times and better respond to the expectations of the people across the world.
And now let's switch to something more lighthearted. On Monday, CMG China Media Group also hosted a special event at the UN introducing the Chinese animated sensation Ne Zha 2. I teamed up with the UN News team for a fun rap session with our guests.
天雷滚滚，
披着我浑身叫喳喳，就不相鞋。年轻革命为主喇叭。
We had a full house for the event. And after the event, attendees shared their thoughts on the film.
I think that it has a very deep meaning, and it is very great to watch this movie as a family. I enjoy graphics, I enjoy sense of humor, I enjoyed the plot.
You first think that some people are bad and some are good, but it turns out totally opposite in the end. So I think it takes a lot of hard work. Like it could take the whole the life of the whole earth to make that movie because it's really good.
Well, next week we'll be closely watching the meetings on Ukraine. But for now, that's all from me. Back to you, Elaine.
Shudeja, thanks.
The risk of regional conflagration is more real today than ever before. This situation must stop before we see the triggering of a widespread regional war, the consequences of which will be devastating.
That was UN Special Envoy for the DRC, Huang Sha. He was among the speakers during the Security Council's third emergency session on the situation there in a month. The M23 armed group has gained control of more territory in the DRC. It now holds the capitals of 2 provinces as well as 2 airports. Thousands have been killed in the span of a few weeks, and hundreds of thousands are fleeing for safety. Aid routes have been largely cut off, and the UN says there are reports of executions of civilians, gender-based violence, and recruitment of child fighters. The UN is calling for a ceasefire and a diplomatic solution to the crisis. The UN is calling for more support for the millions of people impacted by the crisis in Sudan. Fighting erupted nearly 3 years ago. The number of Sudanese displaced is now greater than the entire population of Switzerland. The UN is calling for more than $4 billion in funding to help those in need. Here's Ravina Shamdasani, spokesperson for the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights.
Since April 2023, when the conflict began, it has triggered the world's largest displacement crisis and an unprecedented food security situation, with half the population facing acute food insecurity and famine conditions confirmed in at least 5 locations.
Let's take a look at some of the other issues on the UN's agenda. The WHO plans to continue a mass polio vaccination campaign in Gaza this weekend. Workers hope to vaccinate nearly 600,000 children. Scientists from China, the ROK, Switzerland, and the International Atomic Energy Agency collected seawater samples near Japan's Fukushima nuclear power plant. 2 years ago, Japan began releasing treated wastewater from the plant into the ocean. Fukushima experienced a meltdown in 2011. A new UNEP report calls for urgent action against climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. The agency says countries must cut emissions by 42% over the next 5 years to meet the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement.
Coming up,
I think it is quite clear that multilateralism is the road of the future.
UN Insider.
Pakistan is a charter member of the UN, and in January, the country started a 2-year term as a rotating member of the Security Council. I sat down with Pakistan's Ambassador Munir Akram. Ambassador, what would you say is the most challenging part about being on the UN Security Council at this moment?
Well, I think the greatest challenge we face today is the transition or transformation in the relationships between the major powers. We are moving into a multipolar world where the relationships between the major powers are still uncertain and undetermined. And that is affecting the work of the Security Council on so many issues that we face.
Tell us a little bit more about Pakistan's priorities at the Security Council, at the United Nations, and how you use your voice and your position when it comes to issues, conflicts that you mentioned, Gaza, the DRC, Sudan, and what has been happening in Ukraine.
Our first priority has to be our development, our economic and social development, and therefore we seek to promote greater equity, equitable international economic relations, greater financial support to developing countries, more fairer trade, as well as access to technology. Apart from that, on peace and security, of course, Pakistan's interest is in adherence to the principles of the UN Charter. And that is our approach to all issues. Of course, we are facing immense challenge because of the Gaza war that we've witnessed for the last 15 months or so, in which 45,000 people have been killed. And at the moment, we do not have a clear path to a two-state solution which adheres to the principles of the UN Charter. And the basic principles involved here is the principle of self-determination and the principle of non-acquisition of territory by the use of force. The Ukraine is, of course, a major issue in Europe and for the world. And we are hopeful that negotiations will start, that the conflict will end, and that we will find a viable solution.
Your country has a very long and storied history and involvement with UN peacekeeping, with thousands of peacekeepers sent on missions around the world. Why has this been such an important part of your participation at the United Nations?
Well, Pakistan actually is the host to one of the oldest peace observation missions. So it is quite natural that we feel committed to the concept of UN peacekeeping. And we have been very active since the days of our first mission in the Congo, which is now DRC. We have participated in about 42 missions. UN missions contributed over 120,000 troops over these past decades for UN peacekeeping.
China has the presidency of the Security Council for the month of February, and the theme of China's signature event is maintenance of international peace and security, practicing multilateralism, reforming and improving global governance. What does that mean to Pakistan?
Well, for Pakistan, I think it is quite clear that multilateralism is the road of the future. The international community faces common problems of development, problems of security, problems of climate change. And these are common problems to all of us. And that's why we endorse the concept that President Xi Jinping has outlined of a common future for mankind. And that common future can only be built collectively through multilateralism. And the epitome of multilateralism is here at the United Nations. So we must promote multilateral solutions to all the challenges that we face. And we think that China's concepts, of which President Xi has advanced, the Global Development Initiative, the GDI, Global Security Initiative, the Global Cultural Initiative, these are all building blocks towards a new collective multilateral order. And China's initiative to convene this meeting devoted to multilateralism in the Security Council is, I think, a timely manifestation of China's desire to promote such a common future for mankind. And Pakistan, of course, fully endorses this. We are part of all the three initiatives.
2025 is a big year at the United Nations, marking 80 years since it formed. Can you share any reflections of this body over the past 8 decades and really what its role is in the future?
Well, I always say that if the United Nations didn't exist, we would have to create it. The world today is so complex and so multidimensional in the interaction between states and nations that we need a body of rules on the basis of which we can conduct our relations. And that body of rules is provided by the UN Charter. We have to be able to avoid the existential threats from nuclear weapons, from climate change, from poverty, from devastation that we are facing in so many dimensions. And that future can only be built within the United Nations. So we think the 80th anniversary is a good opportunity for us to find ways to strengthen multilateralism, strengthen the United Nations, and support it as best as we can. And we hope that all countries, all members of the United Nations will join together in this endeavor.
Ambassador Munir Akram, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
UN Insider.
Whether it's about your education, the home you live in, or the items you buy, your money has a story to tell. Because every business story is a human story. Global Business.
There are about 8,324 languages around the world. About 7,000 of them are still in use, but only a few hundred have a place in education systems. The UN estimates a language disappears every 2 weeks. February 21st marks the 25th anniversary of International Mother Language Day. Preserving the world's languages also means preserving culture and traditions. More than 50 indigenous languages are spoken in Mexico, and efforts are underway to create a more inclusive environment for those tongues and for the people who speak them.
In the 21st century, Mexico City is vastly changed from the Aztec to Tenochtitlan. Home to 23 million people, now one of the world's megacities, internal migration from across the country has created a culture of its own.
We are from small communities, and when we come to Mexico City, it's endless. Coming to the city was terrifying. Not knowing Spanish, being afraid. I always tell my wife that the whiter people here scared me.
Juventino Gutierrez is Ayuk, a subcategory of the Mixe indigenous who inhabit the high Sierras of Oaxaca state. A poet, today he chooses to write in his native tongue.
There is something beautiful that says you will always go back to your roots. You were born in a town, you were born with a language, you were born with a world, with an environment, with a people, with an essence. Undoubtedly, I will always be Mixe, even if I don't want to be.
Mexico City's indigenous university is found in one of its most marginalized districts. In the heart of Chimalhuacan, Jesus Jimenez has been attempting to save the culture from dying using the human resources available to him, the modern first-generation indigenous migrants.
This part of Chimalhuacan has been inhabited by people from across the country, principally by indigenous migrants. Mixtecos, Purechas, Nahuas, Triques, Yaquis, Madoremes, Seres, Huastecos, a great diversity of people.
Diversidad de pueblos.
There are some 56 different indigenous languages in Mexico and many hundreds, even thousands, of tribal subcategories of people. Yet in Mexico City, they are almost unheard of, and that's what the institution seeks to change.
We aren't fighting against European culture. We are fighting against the Western mindset that has been instituted here, which has created class conflicts in our country. Within our own communities, we don't value each other. And between our own darker-skinned people, we attack each other more.
Even indigenous people see themselves as inferior. The last time I was home, I stopped by with my old school teacher, and he was cutting a branch from a tree. When we arrived at the school, the branch was used as a cane to punish students who spoke Mixe rather than Spanish in the classroom.
For those who are proud of their indigenous roots, they believe that Mexico's brightest future lies in its clouded past.
We've been made to believe that violence is human nature, that human beings will destroy each other. It's not true. People help each other, and that's our essence. That's the identity of our people. Indigenous communities are the world's reserve of morals.
I'm Elaine Reyes at UN headquarters in New York. Thanks for being a UN Insider. I'm Elaine Reyes at the United Nations headquarters in New York, and this is a special edition of UN Insider.
UN Insider serves as an important window for the global audience to better understand multilateral diplomacy.
It's very important for the media to cover the United Nations, to seek to understand and tell the story in ways that the average person in the street can understand.
I think it's very important that the media should contribute to conveying important messages about the reality of today's challenges.
UN Insider has come to the UN, and we at the UN are so grateful to have it here. It is the only dedicated TV program to what is happening in the UN, and it is reaching so many people with, as it says in its title, inside the UN stories.
Media plays an important role in providing objective information across the world.
We think that media has a strong power of uplifting, what we are trying to convey as messages as developing countries.
We need the mobilization of all peoples, of whole government and whole of society, and media can help us to be informed so that we also can make our part.
I think the media is fundamental to enable citizens across the world, first of all, to understand what is the rationale of having the United Nations. It's not that there is one place on planet Earth that will tell the rest of the world what to do. It is a much more complex story.